What we're going to talk about today is work that's been done over the last 8 years, mapping artificial reefs habitat and bathymetry in Georgia coastal waters. This is work that's been funded by the Department of Natural Resources Coastal Incentive Grant Program and Georgia Sea Grant Program. So why map the bottom? First of all, it's very important for recreational boating safety. As many of you have probably heard, if you haven't been stuck on a sandbar, you haven't been boating in Georgia, is the saying. But in a lot of cases, that's very true because our system is very dynamic. And from time to time, sandbars do shift and we need to know where they are. Secondly, for safety of commercial navigation, we need to understand what the clearance depth, the minimum depth that larger vessels have under their hulls, moving through things like our artificial reef areas. And thirdly, inundation modeling depends on good bathymetry data. And so if we want to have good storm inundation modeling done by the Corps through things like the slosh model, we need to have good bathymetric data. Also, the bottom character and habitats can be mapped very easily using Sidescan sonar, which we'll talk about in a moment. And fundamentally, most of the data here in coastal Georgia is out of date. Most of the sounds were last mapped in the 1930s, other than areas that are important major ports, Brunswick and Savannah. And then the artificial reefs, which were deployed mostly in the 1970s, haven't been examined in detail since that time. Also, the NOAA Hydrographic Survey can't survey all the state waters that we're interested in understanding, just because they have their hands full doing what they're tasked with, enhancing commercial navigation around major ports. And in keeping with the idea of map once, use many times, all the data that we're creating here in Georgia is being added to national bathymetric databases to enhance the knowledge and make use of this data in more ways than just the one. So Sidescan sonar, if you look on the left-hand side of the panel, basically sends out acoustic energy to both sides of the towfish, and depending on whether the bottom is rough or smooth, more or less energy comes back. In areas like a boulder, you get high energy coming back because it's a hard surface. You also get if you look at the bottom, here's what the recording would look like. You also get a shadow, which allows you to calculate how tall the boulder is. That shadow is the area that is not insonified by the Sidescan sonar. Tonal qualities of the bottom tell you something about the coarseness. If you have a generally sandy bottom, if you have muddy sediments associated with that, they will send back less energy and look darker. If you have gravelly or shelly sediments, they will be brighter and send more energy back. How this helps us is that it helps us in several ways. One, obviously, as we insonify complex structures on the bottom like reefs, we can determine the character of the object on the bottom, but also you can see here the shadow that I was talking about, which allows us to calculate the height of structures on the vessel here. Also, it allows us to look at character of the bottom. Here's rippled sands and flat-lying, muddy, silty sediment. And you can see that the amount of Sidescan energy coming back is much greater from these rippled sands than they are from the finer grained sediment. So it allows us to look at bottom character as well. So this is the extent of the bathymetric mapping that we have done in coastal Georgia over the last 8 years. You can see we've mapped the sounds, Ossabaw, Wausau, and Sapelo sounds. We've mapped offshore waters with Sea Grant funding, offshore of the Georgia Sea Islands, and then we've mapped most of the Georgia rivers and are currently mapping deeper regions in the sounds, and we'll talk about that in a little bit later. We've also mapped the offshore reefs, which are within 10 kilometers of shore. These are the reefs that are more likely to be accessed by the public. And that's what we're going to talk about today. You can see here the bathymetry of these reefs, where you have a bathymetry depth scale here, with hot colors being shallow, cool colors being deep. And one thing I hope you'll notice is that although these are all about the same distance from shore roughly, we find a variety of different characteristics, from shallow with large sand ridges to deep with what look like scour depressions, to what look like migrating sand bodies migrating into the south. So there's a lot of variability in what we see in the bottom character. So what does the data look like that we've been collecting mapping these offshore reefs? In general, what we would collect data along swaths that go over structures. So here's a barge sitting on the bottom. Here is a profile, this white line through that structure. And a couple things I want you to notice. Here's the bottom on one side. Here's the profile across that barge. So obviously it flexed in the middle when it hit the bottom. And also you can see that there's about a 1 to 1.5 meter scour on one side of this barge associated with it sitting on the bottom and affecting current patterns. We see another barge with a similar scour pattern associated with it. And also, if we look at the profiles across that barge, you can see a hole cut in the deck that helped it to sink. On the right-hand side here, we just have a couple examples of the kinds of things you can see. Here's a scan over one of those barges, the hole cut in the middle, sitting on the bottom. Here's the side scan sonar image of a similar barge with a hole cut. And then here's a set of wharf pilings sitting on a tonally diverse bottom, where you can see coarser material, which is sending more reflectivity, and finer material with less reflectivity, and these wharf pilings sitting on the bottom. One thing we did see is that in every one of the offshore reefs is that there's a lot of diversity in the Sidescan sonar reflectivity of the bottom, and that's going to be an area of future research. For each of these offshore reef areas, we developed general characteristics, maximum and minimum water depths, and then we mapped where the materials that were placed in these artificial reefs, where they were sitting. We had large targets, which are things like ships, barges, tanks, subway cars, and then small targets, which are much more typically culvert and concrete debris and things like that. If they were large areas that were a large group of material, we called them cluster targets, and they're shown here in white. And if they were isolated individual targets sitting, we called them individual targets and mapped them individually. And then for each area, we were able to provide a distribution of all the materials that have been placed in these reefs so far. So here's the Sidescan sonar image for that same reef. Again, a very different tonal quality. Looking at large targets, here's a barge placed on the bottom. You can see the shadow cast by the barge, coarsening around the barge from scour. And in the bathymetry, you can even see some deposition on one side of the barge and scour along the northern part. And then here's a group of cluster targets, and these are at both the same scale, I should say. So all this data is being input into Georgia's Offshore Artificial Reef Interactive Map, which has all the artificial reefs that Georgia has deployed, and our Sidescan sonar mosaics are being imported. Our locations are being imported for each of these features, and currently we're working with DNR to update the locations of the features. So in most cases where the shipwrecks are supposed to be, that's where they are. But in some cases they're off by some amount, and in some cases there are structures on the bottom that don't have a corresponding location. So all of that's being updated to to better monitor the performance of offshore reefs. We're also mapping deep inshore areas. The reason we're mapping these deep areas is that earlier mapping has shown that there is some interesting hard bottom habitat that is found in areas that are scoured down more than 15 meters deep or so. So we're looking at both larger channels, like this is the Back River near Tybee. This is the Folly River, where we have deep scours, and this is the entrance to St. Andrews Sound. And so we're mapping all these areas when they're greater than 15 meters deep, and are finding a variety of different characteristics. This is the original Sidescan sonar and bathymetry map from the Wilmington River near Skidaway, where we identified these vertical cliffs. This is about 10 meters water depth. This is about 25 meters water depth. So we're looking at a 15-meter high cliff. We've got pinnacles of the same kinds of heights standing out there, kind of like little mini mesas. And if you look at the side scan, we're looking in this direction. So this shadow tells us that this is a vertical wall that's casting a shadow. The same thing here. Here's a shadow. And when we look at the elevations, we look at the depths, we think we're looking at outcropping Miocene units. These are limestone, indurated sandstones, and over-consolidated clays, which from visual observations seem to be supporting large communities of attached sessile species. So that's a summary of the mapping that's been going on here in coastal Georgia. What are we doing and going to be doing in the future? With our offshore reef mapping, we want to start, and we have planned bottom sampling to ground truth the side scan to understand what the tonal qualities are telling us. We want to look at the bottom character in relation to things like inlet throats to see whether that's influencing what's on the bottom now from geologic history. And then we need to plan for the next tier of offshore reefs. In these deep inshore regions, which we're working on right now, we want to start bottom sampling to ground truth the side scan there as well. We need to understand better the distribution and importance of this limestone bottom that we're finding more and more throughout Georgia as we're looking. We need to understand the importance in these scours, both as freshwater inflow areas or saltwater intrusion areas. And we don't have a good handle on that. And then we need to understand the ecosystems on these vertical ledges better over time. Thank you very much.